Right, so we're now beginning, and we're going to introduce our first speaker, but I might introduce myself first. I'm Paul McQuillan. I'm the secretary of the Viktor Frankl Institute in Australia. Our president, Kim Langford, who wanted to be with us, is unable to be with us today because she's unwell. And I'm looking forward to being part of the launch and discussion around Shimon's book, Rediscovery of the Human. I'll let other people talk about that, because if I start talking about the book, and I did write a book review of it, so if you would like to get my book review, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. But I'll steal their thunder. I don't want to do that. So what I'd like to do is to welcome and introduce our guest speaker to begin, who is Professor Alexander Moreira Almeida. And Professor Alexander Moreira Almeida is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Research Centre in Spirituality and Health in the School of Medicine at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. So be kind to him, because in Brazil, it's getting quite late. In fact, it's almost tomorrow. But his eyes are wide open, which is wonderful. He's also chair of the section on spirituality of the Latin American Psychiatric Association. And he has been chair of the section on religion, spirituality and psychiatry of the World Psychiatric Association and their Brazilian Psychiatric Association as well. He's written a number of books, and I won't go through all of them, but he did have co-authorship of a book titled Spirituality and Mental Health Across Cultures, which is an ongoing and important topic. So welcome, Professor, and I'm going to give you the floor. So once you start to speak, what we should see on our screen is a major picture of you, and then we'll all be small pictures up the top. We won't actually see everyone. Please don't forget to mute your microphone if you're not actually talking. And welcome, Professor Moreira Almeida.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Shimon, for the opportunity of being here. I'm very pleased in take part of this book launch. And I would like to say good morning or good evening or good afternoon to everyone. Here in Brazil is 11:30 p.m. So it's a great pleasure indeed being here. I will share my presentation. Let me start here now. Okay, first of all, again, I'd like to congratulate Shimon Cowen for making these translations and making available worldwide this English translation of these very important texts from Viktor Frankl, specifically texts that focus on spirituality. So my presentation, I will try to emphasize some aspects of Viktor Frankl's writings that were translated in this new book that talks specifically more in detail about spirituality. But to start, it's interesting to discuss what is the current evidence regarding some of the main Frankl's claims, that is the impact and the importance of meaning of life for mental health. What is the evidence for that? And also, what is the evidence of the impact of spirituality or religiosity to mental health and also to the meaning of life? Just to start, we can see here a recent study investigating almost 7,000 older Americans that were followed up for 4 years. And they investigated if having a strong sense of life purpose could be a predictor of general mortality. What is most amazing is that even controlling for several sociodemographic and even clinical factors like age, sex, educational level, race, smoking status, physical activity, alcohol consumption, all of this, even controlling for all these variables, people, compared to people who had a higher sense of life purpose, meaning of life, those who had lower levels died 3 times more. So there is a huge impact in having life purpose. So there was a 3 times increase in mortality in those people who had lower levels of meaning of life. The second very important data on this subject, this is what has been called deaths of despair. This is a term that has been proposed by Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton is an economist who is a Nobel laureate, who has showed the important increase of what he called death of despair, that are deaths related to suicide and specifically to alcohol and other drug use. So because drug use, alcohol abuse, and suicide are strongly related to despair, to lack of meaning, lack of hope. And these are some data that he published at the Proceedings of National Academy of Science a few years ago, showing in the last 2 decades a major increase, a huge increase in death by poisoning, specifically with drugs or alcohol, an increase of suicidal deaths, and also increase of chronic liver disease, often related to alcohol. So there has been a major increase in these deaths of despair in the United States, specifically among men. And then even a more recent study published by a group from Harvard University 2 years ago at the American Medical Association, the Journal of the American Medical Association. This is a very big study involving more than 100,000 people that have been followed up for about 15 years. And they investigate also the deaths of despair. Okay? This first, they found basically people who attended religious services at least once a week, they had 3 times lower levels of mortality compared to those who did not attend. So we can see here in some sense the impact of religious involvement in a marked decrease of likelihood of death of despair. And probably one of the mediators of this is that higher levels of religious involvement is related to higher levels of meaning of life. So these are just some more recent data bringing us very high-level evidence regarding some of the key ideas of Viktor Frankl. And also regarding spirituality, the impact of spirituality that we'll discuss now regarding Viktor Frankl. This is the major findings that we have for more than 3,000 empirical studies investigating the impact of religious and spiritual involvement on health and mental health. We, as was stated at the beginning of our talk by Paul, we have just edited a book that has been published by Oxford University Press this year. It's called Spirituality and Mental Health Across Cultures. We have put together more than 30 authors from 11 different countries, summarizing the best scientific evidence nowadays and the clinical implications of this. And on average, the evidence shows that higher levels of religious and spiritual involvement is related to lower general mortality, lower levels of depression, suicidal behavior, substance use and abuse, and higher levels of quality of life, well-being, meaning of life, and human flourish. Of course, there are also some negative impacts of religious spirituality when people have a negative use of spirituality in negative religious coping or extrinsic religiosity. We'll talk a bit more about this later in Frankl's works. Okay, so now let's move to some of the main ideas of Viktor Frankl regarding spirituality. And I'm basing my talk on these 4 texts that are in the book that were translated by Shimon. And here are the abbreviations that we are using on that. So first we start as we know that Viktor Frankl emphasized very much freedom and responsibility. And he called us to be aware of the risks of psychologism, biologism, and sociologism that are deniers of human freedom. If we claim that psychological aspects can explain everything of human beings, or biological aspects or social aspects, that we have no freedom because we would be determined by our psychological drives or our social environments. And it's very important also to be aware of the view of man and the worldview implications embedded in a given psychotherapeutic approach, because very often these worldviews, sometimes these ideologies, are present to us as scientific evidence, as science, and this is not the case. This is, for example, some of these reductionist perspectives of human beings, the very materialist, reductionist views of human beings, views that deny our freedom. Of course, he recognized that we are influenced by these factors, but we are not determined by these factors. And actually, he says in the end that being responsible is the meaning of human existence. So this the core idea that we have the freedom to be above and beyond these factors, sociological, psychological, and biological factors, but we can be beyond them. We are influenced by them, but we are not determined by them. And because of this, we are free. We have freedom and we have responsibility. This is one of the core ideas of the meaning of human being. On the other side, he tells us that he proposed a dialectical twist regarding the meaning of life. We should not ask what is the meaning of life, because actually it's life itself which asks the person. In every situation, each situation, we are asked by life what is the meaning. And in making our choices, we tell what is the meaning for us. And there is always the possibility for us to make choices. Even if we cannot change the situation, we can change our attitudes, the way we suffer, the way we cope with the challenges of life. But also it's very important, as Frankl said, we should remember about the freedom from below, freedom from this instinctual drives, for the biological factors, freedom from below, but also we need to remember that we have freedom to above, freedom to go beyond this the circumstance that we are now, and seek a greater meaning and greater goal. And one of these greater goals is exactly the self-actualization. And it's important to understand also in Frankl's perspective, the self-actualization should not also be a goal in itself. It's possible only to the extent that I lose myself, forget myself, devote myself to an ideal or person. Self-actualization, like happiness, is the byproduct of fulfillment of an ethical value, a self-transcendent value. And now, moving more directly to the religious and spiritual aspects, he calls us, the Homo religions. And one of the main cores of the Homo religions is that the Homo religions sees experience life not only as a task, but as a mission given by God. So it is idea and seeing or experience life as a mission given, a personal mission given by God, it has major psychotherapeutic implications because it provides a strong sense of meaning, of purpose that help us to cope with the challenges of life and also to foster self-actualization. And also, the Homo religious experience the giver of this meaning also. And he also claims that it's not possible to provide a definitive, rational demonstration of God, but it's possible to get a phenomenological demonstration of God because of the metaphysical need of God. People find a need for a love that finds no satisfaction in anything which is found within this world. So this need would be fulfilled only by God. And also another very important aspect that Frankl calls us to remember this, specifically at his time when was much less frequent to talk about spirituality in medicine, spirituality in psychotherapy. It's very good to realize that the last decades, psychologists, psychiatry have accepted much more nowadays the importance of spirituality. But he says that the man is much more religious than he suspects. And it's important to understand that we are not only suppressed drives, but also we have unconscious spirituality, unconscious morality, and unconscious faith. And as we said previously, when the Homo religious experience life as a God-given personal mission, it can raise the consciousness of responsibility to a degree that is eminently significant psychotherapeutically. As we have showed previously in the current robust evidence showing the impact of spirituality on mental health. This is a major factor. Just to give another example about the impact of spirituality on mental health, there is a large study with more than 80,000 people followed up for 14 years in the United States. And even after controlling for many clinical and socio-demographic variables, those people who attended the religious service at least once a week died 6 times less from suicide during this follow-up. 6 times. We probably don't have any other protective factor that is so strong as this. So it's very important how important it is. And this is also important because this is also a byproduct. Because the major goal of a truly religious person is not just to get mental health. People get truly involved with religion because of this need to seek God and to try to follow the image of God. And as a byproduct, there is, for example, this impact on mental health. This is exactly what he says here in types of religious commitment. It's very similar to what with Gordon Allport, that was a psychologist in Harvard, also proposed. Gordon Allport, by the way, had strong connections with Frankl. Frankl cites quite often Allport, and Allport has proposed two major ways of religious commitment. One is extrinsic religiosity, and the other is intrinsic religiosity. The intrinsic religiosity is the way to approach religiosity to take advantage of it, to just select few aspects that are comfortable to me. And the intrinsic religiosity is when the person really tries to and strives to live deeply the religious life. As Allport said, the extrinsically motivated person lives to be served by God. On the other side, the intrinsically motivated religious person lives to serve God. It's exactly what Frankl says here. The superficially religious people, that would be the extrinsically religious person, wants only to ensure himself for the eventuality that there is a God and a beyond, calculating or weighting accounts. It's exactly different from the truly religious person that's much more preoccupied with being accountable and being responsible for fulfilling the God-given mission in life. And also regarding spirituality, Frankl says that logotherapy is open. And indeed, its hallmark is its openness to the theological dimension. It's very important. This is a hallmark of logotherapy. And the idea that we are, as Frankl said, responsible before our conscious. However, the point is conscience the end of the line of the psyche, is the ultimate point, or is the penultimate authority? There is something beyond. And Frankl himself proposed that there is God. God is the source of our ethical values, of our conscience, our conscience. However, of course, we cannot impose these ideas on the patient. And Frankl said, I believe that this, before whom we stand, is a suprapersonal being. And Frankl believed in the objectivity of truth and the objectivity of ethical imperative. They are not just relative constructions, human constructions. And exactly because of that, he also points to the dangers of psychologists. Because psychology projects values of the spiritual realm onto the mental plane, because the spiritual realm would be beyond the mental plane. And if we project this on this lower plane, we can make confusions. For example, we can no longer distinguish the visions of a Bernadette in Lourdes and the hallucinations of a hysterical woman. And in a different book, in The Will to Meaning, Frankl proposed this very illustrative image. We have three-dimensional figures like a cylinder, a cone, and also a spheric ball. But if these three-dimensional figures, objects, solid objects, are projected in a two-dimensional plane, all of them will be very similar. They will be just a circle. But they are very, very different objects. So it's the same happens when we project the spiritual realm only on the mental plane. So, for example, the visions of Bernadette will be very similar to the hallucinations of a hysterical woman. Also, the conscience becomes superego, or the introjection of the Father image, and God becomes the projection of this image. Because, of course, we can have neurotic views of spirituality, but it's not necessarily that all religiosity is neurotic, for example. And regarding, moving to more to the end, what about the ultimate nature of person? He claims that every person is absolutely unique. It's a new person created by God. And the person is spiritual, but it needs its organism to be able to act and express itself in this physical world. As a tool, the organism is a means to an end. So the spiritual being uses the organism and the psychophysical instruments as tools to manifestate itself in this regular life. And based on this, there is the first aspect of the psychiatric credo that he calls. the belief in the persistence of the spiritual person, even behind the foreground symptoms of a psychotic illness, even when there are severe impairment in the brain functioning. Despite that, the spiritual being, the spiritual person is still whole, trying to communicate through impaired mechanisms. And because of that, also, we can assure the dignity of the person, despite the limitations or even the severe damages and injuries of the physical body. And also, he has the second psychotherapeutic credo, the belief in the ability of the soul without the human, under all conditions and circumstances, to pull back from its psychophysical dimensions and to assume a distance from it, and then make choices, despite all this situation. And he said, inasmuch as the person can distance and elevate itself from the psychophysical, does the spiritual emerge into manifestation. It can go beyond this psychophysical manifestation. And now, regarding the ultimate nature of person, what death can tell us about this. He says that in death, the total loss of the psychophysical I, but all that remains is the self. The spiritual self remains, even after the loss of the psychophysical I. And so death awakes us to a more authentic, to a more real reality of ourselves. And only when the person is grasped as intrinsically spiritual is it lifted out of the mortality of the psychophysical. The idea that we go beyond the death of the body. Okay. By the way, this is one of my research areas, and we will publish the mid of this year by the publisher Springer a book called The Science of Afterlife, scientific discussions on this. So finally, regarding the approach, how can we approach the patient's spirituality? First, we, as therapists, we must instill the sense of freedom, responsibility of meaning. This is the core of logotherapy. We instill the sense of freedom, responsibility of meaning. And as we saw previously, according to Frankl, the spiritual aspect of human beings is that one that warrants the freedom and then generates responsibility. However, we must keep a strict neutrality regarding what is the meaning of life of each person, or even if the person will find some spiritual meaning, some religious meaning in his or her life. However, even if we should keep a strict neutrality, existential analysis should not block the door to transcendence, like many other psychotherapeutic approaches block the door, shut the door to transcendence. The door should remain open for people to go out of spirituality or to go in back to spirituality. Frankl also called for cooperation between the doctor and the clergyman. There is no antagonism between a religious approach and a non-religious therapeutic approach. They can make an addition, a cooperation. And then we should explore spirituality of our patients. However, we need to be aware that the intimate religious life resists gratuitous exposure and exhibition. We need to be very sensitive, very careful, patient-centered in this approach, never imposing our religious or anti-religious beliefs. And it's interesting that he said that we cannot prescribe meaning. However, it's sufficient simply to stop blocking the process of discovery of meaning. Because as we are usually homo-religious, we are really usually very prone to spirituality. If we start to discuss meaning in these more deep aspects of life, usually spirituality is brought by the patient. But the problem is when our psychotherapeutic approach or our educational approach blocks spirituality. For example, he says in a very strong way, direct way, stops preaching that God's nothing but a father image, and religion nothing but the collective obsessional neurosis. Also, stop teaching models of human being that undermines the normal orientation to moral purpose, the idealism which young people naturally process. Stop preaching that we are just animals, just naked apes. Stop preaching that we are just generated by conditioned behavior or just produced by our instinctual drives, or we are just products of the social and economic force that we are in. So he calls us to stop doing this. And it also is important because, as I said previously, if we start to discuss these topics, usually the patients brings naturally these topics of spirituality very often. And the effect of a religious answer to the ultimate questions of the patient about the meaning of existence is generally much deeper when this answer is not given quasi-lectured by the doctor, but when the patient alone can say it to him or herself. So it's very interesting that Frankl says that even without intending, religion, as we see it, we saw previously, may contribute to mental health. But also, in the other way around, psychotherapy may prompt religiosity of patients just by start discussing these deeper aspects of meaning and of life. And finally, the ultimate self-actualization. According to Viktor Frankl, the person is to be understood finally as the likeness of God. The human can comprehend him or herself only from the perspective of the transcendence. So the most important way to understand us is the likeness of God and the perspective of transcendence beyond the psychophysical aspects. The human is human only insofar as he grasps himself in relation to God. The conscience is the registry of transcendence. The true discovery of the human, the inventio hominis, occurs in imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. So the self-actualization, the true discovery of human being comes from this. So this is, here I stop finishing these major ideas of Viktor Frankl in this book, in this translation. So it's very good that nowadays psychiatry, this is the position statement from the World Psychiatric Association, the position statement directing psychiatrists all over the globe to taking in consideration spirituality of patients in teaching, research, and clinical practice. So this is a guideline for the 3,000 psychiatrists around the globe. And this position statement is available in different languages, so it can be found for free. So in here are also some my contacts for those who'd like to contact me later. Thank you very much.
So, Professor, thank you very much. And people might like to write down the contact. We'll come back. If you like, keep that slide there. We can put it up later anyway if we need to, so people have your contact. But just in case they haven't had a chance to write it down, the email is at the top there. and I'm sure we could make sure that you have that anyway. Professor, if you email your email to me, then I'll make sure that it goes out to our members as well.
Okay.
But thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You've gone to a lot of trouble to do that for us, and we're most grateful for what you have done. So when you're ready, if we unshare the screen, and people are coming back to us, what my role is to try to link this together. Now, I'm not exactly sure how we link directly, but I would like to invite Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cowen, whose book this is for the launch, to perhaps speak from his own perspective on the book and what it teaches him, what he knows about Frankl, because to me the book was showing us an early Frankl, which is always interesting because every human being will develop over time. So I'm always interested with Shimon's significant translations of early Frankl works that we've never seen in English before. Shimon has a dual background as a secular academic and also has a doctorate in social philosophy, and he has qualifications as well in rabbinic studies. And he's founded in 1998 the Institute of Judaism and Civilization with a view to establishing some sort of interface of communication between religious studies and the world of the secular arts and sciences. One of the areas that particularly interests him is the interface with psychology, with particular reference to the work of Viktor Frankl, whose work he's translated on numerous occasions over the years. Welcome, Shimon. I'm going to give the floor to you. So please begin when you're ready and jump in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to Dr. Paul McQuillan, who is presently the secretary, but he was the founder of the Viktor Frankl Institute of Australia. Thank you very much for hosting this book launch. I'm a member of the Viktor Frankl Institute of Australia, and I'm honored by your help and cooperation and auspices. And thank you very, very much, Professor Moreira Almeida. I'm really enormously grateful to you. I remember we met just before this pandemic hit the world, minutes before it seems, in a conference in Jerusalem. And that was a conference of the World Psychiatric Association at the end of particularly of the section of that association dealing with religion, spirituality, and psychiatry, of which Professor Moreira Almeida was a committee member and more, maybe chair if I'm not mistaken. So I'm extremely honored that a person who holds the keys to the World Forum of the World Psychiatric Association should have done the honor of helping, if you like, place Viktor Frankl on the stage. Now, Frankl didn't need to be put on the stage. He was well known for he was being well known at the grassroots level for more than half a century. But for some strange reason, whilst Frankl struck a huge resonance with popular culture, he received relatively little credence from academic psychology. And this might, and I think he himself says that the reason was because largely of the dominance of Freudianism for so long. Now other streams are dominant, but I'm extremely gratified that a person like Professor Moreira Almeida is one of those who can help Frankl back to the recognition which he deserves. So thank you again for your help and kindness. Now, I thought what I'll do is sort of, I will mingle, as Paul suggested, I might just sort of mingle some personal experience and talk a little about about what it is that actually motivated me in my involvement with Frankl. So straight away, I must tell you, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I do hold a doctorate in social philosophy, and I studied in Germany for a number of years. So this gave me, if you like, the philosophical equipment and language to approach the work of Frankl, who is as much a philosopher as a psychologist. And it's very clear that he's the psychological, philosophical underpinnings of his psychology are very important. And one, the practice, his psychological practice and his philosophical teachings, they reflect one another. So I also have a theological background, as Paul mentioned. I pursued rabbinic studies, but in recent times, I've been very much interested in the core shared values of the great world religions. These are known as the Noahide laws, after the biblical survivor of the flood, Noah, with whom civilization was renewed. And it was renewed on the basis of acceptance of a fundamental code out of which the great world religions spring. So whilst this may sound very strange to people that there is such a thing as the Noahide laws, it in fact is a living reality. And it's been acknowledged, for example, by the United States Congress, who recognize these ethical principles as the bedrock of society since the dawn of civilization. It's been recognized by a president of the European Union, by the head of an Islamic state, King Mohammed of Morocco, and Australian Governor General, and there are others too. So this is something which is ancient, but also profoundly actual. And it's an area which I've studied. I wrote a book called The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, which actually documents these universal ethics. If you like, you could call it, if I may say so, it's the sort of the content, the shared content of universal conscience in the light in religious terms. There's a cross-cultural, cross-religious resonance of these values. So, therefore, when I speak about theology, I'm not speaking from a Jewish perspective, but I'm speaking what I hope is a universal perspective, to the extent that we can distill these universal values. Now, what drew me to psychology in the first place, before I came to Frankl, was my awareness of the fact that as a member of a religious community, religious people, like anybody else, they have psychological needs and sometimes psychological difficulties. The problem was that when a religious person or a child from a religious family seeks to access psychological help, at once there is the concern that the child or the adult is being placed at the mercy of a embedded worldview in a particular psychology, which could actually attack the religious values. And Professor Moreira Almeida alluded to this. So it seemed to be very, very, and of course this was evident, I suppose, preeminently in Freudianism. Freud was the one who spoke about the instinctual bases of human nature. He discredited the concept of the human soul. He was, in a sense, not by no means, if he was, but ostensibly he was not a religious person at all, and that colored a lot of psychology. So, well, Freud, of course, Freud's heyday passed, but there were new psychologies, new psychological doctrines, and the problem was what kind of circumspection does a religious person need not to be, in some sense, negatively affected by the worldview and the psychology following that worldview of the particular therapist. So that got me interested in this question even before I came across the work of Viktor Frankl. Now, it's owing to a friend of mine in Melbourne, Dr. Mac Gelman, that I was introduced to the niece of Viktor Frankl, who was living in Melbourne. Frankl's sister had come to live in Australia, and she passed on, but her daughter, whose name was Liesl Cosma, who is the translator one of the essays in this book. She's passed away now, unfortunately. I met with her and she handed me a box of books of Frankl, which largely were untranslated into English. And I began serially over the years to select pieces from this box of early works of Frankl. And indeed later, there's a significant piece in the book which we're reviewing now is not from that box, but it's a transcript of a very important dialogue held between Frankl and a friend of his. It appears there as the Science of the Soul. At all events, as I began to look into the work of Frankl, I could see certain principles which were deeply resonant with a spiritual standpoint. Of course, these are, as Professor Moreira Almeida has outlined, that Freud saw the basis of human personality in instinctual impulses, and basically that sought to analyze mental health in terms of the repression or de-repression or desublimation of these impulses. Freud did not believe in conscience, and to the contrary, he saw it as a mere invention, a social fiction with all sorts of repressive consequences. So he had very little sense of the spiritual or the religious. Frankl, who started out as a student and a disciple of Freud, came to his own work, his own position as a reaction against Freud. He saw that the essential human being in the faculty of conscience. Of course, he recognized the dimensions of the psychophysical self, the somatic and the mental dimensions of human personality. But he gave a tremendous importance to the faculty of conscience, or the religious person would call that the soul. And he dwelt upon the theme of self-transcendence, whereby the human being can actually expose that spiritual faculty within oneself. One of the fascinating things which I find in Frankl is his statement, which is actually brought out in the writings translated in this book, that when one embarks upon self-transcendence, now briefly, what does it mean to transcend oneself? It means to transcend one's psychophysical self, to transcend the physical and mental constraints or limitations upon one's own existence. And these could be internal constraints, internal difficulties, psychological. They could be external, as we know, for example, the person who suffers from external factors, such as the conditions in the concentration camp. But that in either case, the human being was able to rise above the predicament of the psychophysical self. Now, this is one thing which absolutely intrigued me about Frankl, is that whilst he saw that even the secular human being, the person who regarded him or herself as an agnostic or an atheist or had no particular spiritual affiliation or anything of that sort, once that person embarked upon the process of self-transcendence, and self-transcendence means basically asking the question, not what do I want of life, but what does life want of me? Now, even when the secular person would ask that question, Frankl said, and it's in one of the essays in this book, he says that person has embarked upon a trajectory, upon a, if you like, a process, a movement towards meaning, at the terminus of which the religious person has already arrived. In other words, Frankl says a very startling thing. He says that this idea of the self-transcendence, the idea of this concept of the ultimate makeup, spiritual makeup of the human being, which is fully self-conscious in a religious person, and only partly self-conscious. In the unreligious or in the person or not conscious at all, it is actually going along one route. It's headed towards one route. It's headed towards a goal. And that goal is this amazing statement, which absolutely, as they say, blew me away when I first read it in the works of a psychologist, that as it's already been quoted by Professor Moreira Almeida, is this, that the ultimate discovery of the human being is the image of God, which means, in theological terms, the imitation of God means the seeking to replicate divine ways, divine attributes. Just as God is kind, you should be kind. Just as God has judgment, you should have judgment. All of these qualities, which in fact translate into universal ethics. So he says there is an ultimate content to human conscience, to which the self-transcending person heads. And the religious person is there, and the non-religious person who is honestly and sincerely upon self-transcendence is also headed in that direction. And I would put it this way, I would say, because the person has simply exposed the spiritual within him or herself through the act of self-transcendence. Anyway, so basically, this was for me a very important idea. And but then, of course, equally important is this notion of freedom and responsibility, to which Professor Moreira Almeida has drawn attention. And the source of human freedom is basically that a person has a choice whether to, literally to be driven to obey the dictates of the psychophysical self, in other words, to follow impulse, to follow perceptions, just as way these surge within the human being, or to follow conscience, to follow a value ideal, which is accomplished precisely through self-transcendence from and above the psychophysical self. That is where freedom emerges from this choice. To be simply to be driven to allow oneself to follow this impulse or that impulse, that's not freedom. That is simply the decision whether to allow oneself to be impelled by the dictates of these psychophysical interests or those psychophysical interests. The real choice, the real freedom consists in the ability to choose between interests coming from the psychophysical self and interestlessness. In other words, the standpoint of a conscience which has elevated itself above that. Now, we may return to accept certain of our impulses. I have an impulse to eat. That's a very worthy impulse. And there are a whole host of impulses which are. But many of the impulses and desires and perceptions are in fact modified. Some are accepted, some are rejected, some are altered, some are modified by the person who is consulting conscience. So this notion that this notion of the sovereignty of conscience within the human being and freedom to determine and to discover meanings and values according to which to live, that's a key point. That is something which is a key lesson from Frankl. Now, here, however, I want to take things a step further, and this is where I think the work of Frankl is extremely important today. You see, for years, ever since Man's Search for Meaning was published and people paid attention to it, and it was actually Gordon Allport who got it published in English for the first time, people have affirmed this idea of meaning. The human being quests meaning, and that's a very true point, very valuable point, which we take from, and also that the human being is free to live according to meaning and not according to impulse. But I hear, however, there is a newer dimension comes out in this work, and particularly in these early writings of Frankl. Now, I must be honest and say that Frankl himself equivocated on this various point, and I draw attention to a certain equivocation. But that doesn't worry me. I am latching on to one dimension in Frankl's work, which I think is extremely fruitful. Now, the question is quite simple. Yes, for the human being, meaning is very important. But does that mean any meaning? is any meaning as good as the next meaning? Now, this is a very important question. In other words, because it takes us to the brink of the question of moral relativism. Frankl himself in numerous places, and I've sought to document it, certainly the essays which I bring out, which I translate in this book, rejects moral relativism. Frankl believed, certainly in the passages which I have translated, that there are certain objective universal moral standards. Now, this is this is something which is it's very significant, very important for contemporary psychology, for two reasons. There is the question of truth. It's a philosophical issue. We have to deal with the question of moral relativism. After all, a terrorist also has meaning. The attendant in a concentration camp, the Nazi attendant, also has a worldview, also has meaning. Is that meaning as valid as other meanings? Does it betoken a healthy personality? So we have that question. But then there's another issue, and that is the question is that when psychology itself when psychology itself is forced to face this question, that psychology itself is forced to ask the question in its patients, whether the patient exhibits a meaning which is pathological or a meaning which in some sense could be said to be healthy. Now, as we mentioned before, from the standpoint of therapeutic method, Frankl never he was not dictating values to his he was not dictating values to his patients, but he was seeking to prompt them ultimately to some concept of self-transcendence, to allow them to open the door of self-transcendence. And I think that Frankl believed that once we open this door to self-transcendence, we are opening the door to certain objective and universal values. So this question it becomes a very, very real question for us in our day and age right now, because the worldview which psychology takes for itself, and let me make it quite clear, and I believe this is philosophically sound and right, every psychotherapeutic method presupposes a model of the human being. And it also presupposes certain fundamental assumptions as to what constitutes the normality and the health of the human being. Now, if psychology itself has taken a view, which Frankl regarded Freudianism having done, which is not an authentic view of the human being, then psychology itself becomes part of a zeitgeist. It becomes part of a cultural force, a cultural ideology, which in turn impacts not just the patient, but the society as a whole. And in fact, Frankl viewed Freudianism as a religion which believed itself to be a science. In other words, it was a very clear view of what the human being was and what the human being was not. So, in other words, the standpoint which psychology takes is going to impact both its patients and the culture. And so this is, and in fact, the significance of psychology and psychotherapy is huge. I dare say that psychology is popular philosophy. It presents a model of the human being, and it affects culture. It has a tremendous impact. It has a tremendous impact on culture itself. And it's ultimately going to work its way down into the most practical consequences. Now, I want to actually adumbrate this without being too political, because I respect the fact that there are many people of many opinions and views here. But we are now living in an age in which much psychology has certain features of Freudianism. It's not Freudianism, but what it was, what Frankl disliked in Freudian theory was what he called its pan-determinism. its notion that the human being was determined by impulse and perception, and that the human being could only be healthy if the person could, if those instincts and perceptions could in some sense be de-repressed or repressed. He viewed ill health, he saw, as the checking of those primal instincts in many ways. It's a potted version of Freudianism. We have to ask ourselves these days whether certain major areas in mainstream psychology and psychiatry are not doing the same thing. Whether they are saying that the human being is what an impulse or what a perception drives the person to be. The person is, if you like, has a nature which is unmodifiable, or the person is not essentially free, and that there is no real things, no such thing as conscience, which could stand against the actualization of impulse and perception. So we are back in Professor Moreira Almeida is a much greater authority than I am in current state of psychology, but we are in a current situation where major domains of therapy are saying this. They are saying it even more radically than Freud said. And in contradistinction towards these trends, we have to ask ourselves: is there a conscience which the human being could legitimately invoke against his or her own impulses? Be unhappy with his or her own impulses, be unhappy with his or her own perceptions, and want to change them in the light of conscience. Does the person have that right? Does the person have the freedom? Does the person have the ability to do so? And I'm sure Freud would have Frankl's idea of freedom and responsibility through consultation with conscience is something which is a message of Frankl which is more relevant than ever before. I must end with a note that this is not just a theoretical question, because unfortunately I live in a state of Australia, Victoria, which has just enacted legislation. And it has actually banned therapy for people who are unhappy with their own sexual orientation. It has placed a 10-year prison sentence on a therapist who will assist a person to do battle with a particular orientation with which they're not happy. This is a situation. It has come into religious schools to ban the teaching of certain religious teachings concerning human sexuality. It interferes with the curricula of schools. It sets up informers to report on families where parents have said to an adolescent child things which teachings of their own religion in regard to the formation of and the development of attitude. So it's not a theoretical question. Even in the days of Freud, there were no 10-year jail sentences for therapists who wanted to produce a therapy other than Freud's. So I'm sorry, I don't want to become political, but we are in a state of emergency, because in many ways the pan-deterministic features of much contemporary psychiatry and psychology have actually turned into a repression of human freedom, a repression of religious freedom, an invasion of religious schools and communities, and it's extremely serious. So we need Frankl now to reassert the integrity of conscience, the freedom of conscience, and that these should be implemented within psychotherapy therapeutic practice. So I could talk much more about the book. I wrote a long introduction to it, in which I discussed what I call the moral structure of personality, and how Freud, in fact, was redeemed by Frankl, and how how Frankl's ideas gel with certain aspects of religious tradition. But maybe this is something which could be which is a separate discussion. And I'm grateful to Professor Almeida Moreira for at least bringing to the, for so succinctly and clearly summarizing the content of Frankl's own words. At all events, thank you very much for honoring me with this session. And perhaps now, Paul, you'd like to open it for questions. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Shimon, and thank you, Professor, for your two presentations. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. One of the things that we can do, we can certainly use the chat, but also you do have the capacity to have reactions. That sort of reaction there is sort of saying something's good, and it does disappear. But this type of reaction, which is raising your hand, does not disappear. It's really asking a question. The difficult thing is that just because we're not all on the screen at the one time, we'll have to keep our eyes open for raised hands. And when you raise your hand, you actually physically need to go back to the reactions again and lower your hand, otherwise it won't go away. And it does keep some, I suppose, structure in a discussion if people do begin to raise their hands, because if you have 2 or 3 people who want to talk at once, somebody comes in and goes over the top. So let's invite some discussion. I don't think we'll have a problem if somebody just jumps in and wants to actually say something by way of thanks, questioning, whatever. But once we start that, perhaps the raising hand concept is good. I noticed there were a few comments here. But they were more comments rather than questions. So here we have a question. Does Freudian style psychiatry session pose a danger to the religious, to the God-believing person, or to the religious believing person, or a psychiatrist officially taught to respect the religious person? So either Professor or Shimon, over to you. That's a question.
I'm very happy to hear from Professor Moreira Almeida.
Could you please say the question again?
The Freudian style psychiatry sessions, I'm not sure how many of those there are exactly these days, but do psychiatry sessions potentially pose a danger to the religious person, or are psychiatrists sufficiently taught to respect the religious person? I mean, I have a personal view on that, but you're the professor. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. This is a very, very important question. Actually, unfortunately, for many years, the psychiatric training and the psychological training involved some very negative views of religion, that religion would be a part of a neurotic personality, that religion would be a product of an immature personality. So, unfortunately, sometimes psychiatrists and psychologists react not very openly to religious experiences, to religious beliefs, and sometimes they try to move patients from religious perspectives to more materialistic or secular perspectives. And even when they do not do that, sometimes they just not pay attention to the religion of the patient or the patient's spirituality. And because of that, and many patients feel not comfortable with therapists not taking in consideration their religiosity. And because of this, for example, the position statement of the World Psychiatric Association that we raised at the end of my talk was exactly trying to solve this problem, showing and emphasizing that psychiatrists should pay attention in patients' religion and spirituality in a very respectful way. We as psychiatrists, we should never impose our beliefs, religious or anti-religious beliefs. The approach must be patient-centered. The problem is that most psychiatrists and psychologists and health professionals in the world have not received the proper training in how to deal, to approach this spirituality. So there has been many efforts nowadays in creating curriculum to include spirituality in training on mental health professionals.
Thank you, Professor. I notice there's a chat going on here that I'll try and summarize for you and for Shimon. It centers around Frankl and his presentation of logotherapy as a secular therapy. Is it going a step beyond Frankl to say, well, the ultimate journey is going to end up in a religious direction? And then coupled with that is, well, what about religious people who perhaps use religion wrongly? How does Frankl's logotherapy look at that? That's a good question. Again, I'm sure there are many, many views, but we have the Professor and Shimon here, so I'm going to pass that over to them. I hope I've summarized it correctly for you.
Well, if I may, yes, of course, religion can be used as a veneer for, for very unwholesome things. There's no question about that. We've seen that. But at the same time, I think that Frankl's own criterion of self-transcendence establishes what is an authentic religiosity and what is not. In other words, self-transcendence means that the person, it's another word, if you like, for humility. It means that the human being says, I'm not pushing a personal agenda here. Religiosity does not become a vehicle for some sort of national triumphalism or anything of that sort. That's one side, because I think everybody will recognize that yes, religion has presented itself as religion, but in some cases, but in fact, it's just a guise for a political movement. So that's not. And the triumphalism, the violence, the attitude, that shows that there's something wrong. There's something wrong with it. By the same token, we have to be very careful about psychology arbitrating what is genuine religion. In other words, yes, there are cases where religion is used as a veneer for some sort of violent or triumphalist movement, and that's not real religion. But by the same token, who can say what true religion is? In other words, is there something? Can psychologists say? Could any particular psychologist tell you this is authentic, that is not authentic? I think that's a very big problem. I don't think it's, in other words, and Frankl himself said that, in a sense, psychology has to open to a theological dimension, because it can't make itself an authority in what is authentic religion and what is not authentic religion. But what it can do, as mentioned before, is to apply the test of self-transcendence to religion itself. Is there real humility? Is there real self-examination? Is this authentic religion or is it not? Can't hear you, Paul. You're muted, Paul.
I know I'm muted and my mouse is rather slow. So that was the problem. Thank you, Shimon, for the response. Are there further questions? I'm looking around for anybody who may have raised their hand, who might like to jump in and ask a question. I'll throw one in myself, because from that last answer, Shimon, and the professor may have a particular perspective on this as well. I hear you almost saying that James Fowler's stages of faith would define the fundamentalist religious person as somebody who simply follows practices and nothing much else, as not necessarily self-transcendent, but there are in fact developments beyond that. And I'd also throw in a question to say, I think I heard, Professor, you may not be, I may have not got this wrongly, but I almost heard you saying, which would be a personal position, look, if you have a client who wants to talk about religious matters and you are not comfortable, you should refer him to somebody else or refer them somewhere else.
So well, I'll answer my part of it first, and I'll hand it to Professor Moreira Almeida. I think that it's very important to take religion on its own terms. In other words, religious faith, we have great world traditions. We have Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and there's Confucianism, there and so on and so forth. Now, I am of the opinion that there are a set of common denominator values at the core, at the root of it, more or less, the root of it. And I don't know that, this, in other words, what these are essentially to be discovered through a historical and theological examination. I don't think that the psychologists, so whether this is Gordon Allport or anybody else, I'm not acquainted with Fowler's work myself, but can say what a religious person is and what religion is. Religion has its own integrity. It's a millennial tradition. It's a tradition that's been going on for thousands of years, and by people who are not sick people. They're healthy people. They're people who have lived and lived in these faiths and drawn strength from these faiths and so on and so forth. So we don't have to psychologize religion per se. I do think that there are certain, frankly, I think that ISIS, there can be very violent movements which are repudiated even by Islam itself, and there can be also all sorts of erratic behavior which takes on a religious veneer. But the mainstream traditions, I think, have to be taken on their own terms. They actually have been lived by human beings for thousands of years, and so that's I think that's an important point to make.
And before I invite the professor, I noticed there are two comments here which are probably part of this conversation. One is saying fundamentalist religion may be a projection of the superego. That's a comment. And then another comment says professional humility and realizing the limits to one's scope of training and practice can help deal with psychologism. And I think that's probably along the lines of the other comment that I made before. But Professor, can you make some?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think there are boundaries of the ethical boundaries for the to where we as health professionals can go. Of course, we cannot say that such a religion is good or bad, or such religious belief is good or bad. This is not our point. And if the person has basically religious questions and spiritual quest, of course, it should be more probably and better referred to a religious person to discuss these points. However, there are some people, first, that would not like to discuss this with a religious leader, but would like to discuss this in their psychotherapy. And there is this point, and there is also the second point. We as mental health professionals, or health professionals as a whole, we must pay attention to all factors that impact patients' health and well-being. We must pay attention to the sexual life, to the finances of the person, to to the spirituality, to family relationships. So we need to take in consideration all these aspects. And in psychotherapy, for example, we need to understand this and also how patients think about this. And in the psychotherapeutic approach, for example, you got the meaning of life and meaning of the life struggles. When help patients to think about this, well, of course, we should not direct patients to such or such direction, but help them in these discussions. And as Frankl had said, quite often we ask this kind of, for example, a very common question we as psychiatrists ask, what helps you to cope with this illness, to cope with the death of a loved one? Very often they bring religious things, religious belief, religious practices, and we cannot stop them. Okay, we cannot say this here. Of course, there are several studies nowadays, actually randomized controlled trials, for example, about cognitive behavioral therapy that integrates patients' religious beliefs. For example, we ask patients, which kind of religious and spiritual practices and beliefs have helped you throughout your life? Or do you think could be helpful to you now? And then we can stimulate them to use their own religious and spiritual resource from their own traditions. Of course, we cannot impose our thoughts and our beliefs. So these are some general ideas of this topic.
I don't have any more chats at the moment, and I know that some people have already said, look, I'll just have to go. So I don't want to lose people before we actually bring this forward to you. I'm just going to put this up in front of you. That's the book, The Rediscovery of the Human. And that is available. I think if you go to Amazon, you'll certainly find it. I know you can find it on local book distributors as well. It is a print-on-demand book, and so it can be printed in your own country if you can find that book online somewhere with a provider. It's not a terribly expensive paperback, and I did write a book review of it, appreciating, I hope, the very, very significant scholarship that has gone into putting it all together, and I suppose the lens it gives us on Viktor Frankl himself and his own development of ideas. So I'm putting that in front of people now so that you can see it. I can come back to it, but Shimon, you might want to say something, or Professor, I know it must be getting to about 1:30 in the morning. So it is getting fairly late. I really appreciate your presence and Shimon's presence and the presence of the rest of the audience as well. Is there one last question from anyone? Please just unmute your microphone and I'm sure we'll hear you. Otherwise, I will invite some last words from...
Sorry, I've got a question, Paul.
There's a question. Thank you, Ed.
Sorry, could I ask Shimon a question? I guess it's directed to him. My understanding of logotherapy was that it was either, or the Frankl's teaching was based in a non-secular or secular way, so that it would be attractive universally. Is the concept of logotherapy I'm now getting the feeling that I understood his ultimate meaning, but are we moving away from that, or have I misinterpreted what logotherapy is, how Frankl meant it to be interpreted?
Well, as I say, Frankl himself was never, it's for everybody. It's not, it has the simple goal not to lecture values to people, but to help them embark on the path of self-transcendence. Now, of course, logotherapy is, he always said, is a supplement to other psychotherapies as well. It's not, it's not something which, it's unlikely that it would always be held in isolation from other therapies, but it is, if you like, the spiritual or philosophical complement to other kinds of psychotherapies, and should be held and could be held conjunctly with them. But it's for everyone. It's for the secular person and for the religious person alike. The notion being, however, what is the common denominator is that every human being is capable of self-transcendence. Where and how far that self-transcendence takes one will vary, will be different. But it is it's a common ability of every human being, and that everybody has a faculty which enables them to embark upon self-transcendence. And so in that sense, and one may be at various different stages along the route, but I think that is what he has in mind. But I just wanted to say, however, that it doesn't, but I think Frankl believed that self-transcendence ultimately ends up in as we call the imitation of God. But he would never say that probably to a secular patient. All we ask now is to ask oneself, what does life want of me, not what do I want of life? And that's enough. That's for everybody.
Thank you, Shimon. Professor, did you have anything to sum up or some final words? I'm just aware that we promised to finish at 3 p.m. in Melbourne. Will be 1:30 a.m. in Brazil.
No, it's okay. I just like to thank you all again for this opportunity, and Shimon for translating this very important text. And I learned a lot studying. Yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you. I wish to thank all of you too, particularly Professor Moreira Almeida and Paul and all of you for joining in. Thank you so much.
And please remember that the book is available. All you have to do is to go online. You'll find it at Amazon. You'll find it at places in Australia like Booktopia. It is available as an ebook or as a paperback, but it's all there, The Rediscovery of the Human. And if anybody would like to have a book review, I think I wrote a very good book review for you, Shimon.
You did indeed.
And I'm quite happy to email it to you. You'll just need to send an email to that one, admin@vfia.org, and say, can I have that book review, please? And I'll send it to you. It probably takes a fairly even-handed approach to what is there. Well, thank you very much, Shimon. Thank you, Professor, for staying up with us. And I see some thank yous are coming through. One way to say thank you, of course, is just to simply say that was good, because you've got that reactions button down the bottom. And I really enjoyed being with you. So thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for the presentations.
Thank you all indeed. Thank you so much. All the best. Bye.
And
bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the meeting and stop the recording from now.